What if I told you that in just 69 years, a nation rose from revolution, survived famine and terror, defeated Nazi Germany, raced America to space, pointed nuclear missiles at the world, and then vanished without a single foreign army conquering it? This is the story of the Soviet Union, a superpower born in blood in 1922, shaped by the iron rule of Joseph Stalin, challenged in the Cold War, and ultimately unraveled under Mikhail Gorbachev. How did a state powerful enough to send the first human into space collapse from within debris? Stay with me, because this isn't just history. It's the rise, the fear, the glory, and the dramatic fall of one of the most powerful empires the modern world has ever seen. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. In the winter of 1922, as snow drifted across the battered streets of Moscow and Petrograd, a new nation was born from the wreckage of empire. The old Romanov world of palaces and peasants, of orthodox bells and imperial banners, had fallen in revolution and civil war. In its place rose something audacious, something untested. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union. It was not merely a country. It was an idea that history could be engineered, that inequality could be abolished, that workers and farmers, long bent under the weight of czars and aristocrats, could stand upright and shape their own destiny. At its founding stood Vladimir Lenin, frail in body but fierce in conviction. Lenin believed that revolution was not chaos but science, that the state could be remade through discipline and ideology. And so, in December 1922, Russia joined with Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics to form a union unlike any the world had seen. But revolutions, like storms, rarely settle gently. When Lenin died in 1924, the struggle for succession was not philosophical, it was ruthless. Emerging from the shadows of party bureaucracy was a quiet, calculating figure, Joseph Stalin. Where Lenin had been the architect, Stalin became the enforcer. He believed the revolution must be protected at any cost. The 1930s would become a decade of iron and blood. Stalin launched forced collectivization, herding millions of peasants into state-controlled farms. Resistance was labeled treason. Grain was seized. Famine swept across Ukraine in what many now remember as the Holodomor. Industrialization followed, rapid, relentless. Factories rose from frozen soil. Steel production soared. The Soviet Union transformed itself from an agrarian society into an industrial power in barely a decade. Yet progress came wrapped in fear. The Great Purge tore through the Communist Party, the military, and ordinary households. Neighbors whispered. Confessions were extracted. Millions were sent to the Gulag labor camps, scattered across Siberia's vast emptiness. The state promised equality. It delivered surveillance. It promised justice. It enforced obedience. And then came war. In 1941, Adolf Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and unleashed Operation Barbarossa. The German invasion was swift and brutal. Cities burned. Villages vanished. At Stalingrad, in the ruins along the Volga, the Red Army made its stand. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of survival. 27 million Soviet citizens would die in what they called the Great Patriotic War. 27 million stories silenced, yet from the ashes emerged victory. In 1945, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. The Soviet Union stood not only intact, but expanded, its influence stretching across Eastern Europe. The world now stood divided. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not declared with cannon fire, it was whispered through ideology. Democracy versus communism. Capitalism versus state planning. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. The nuclear age had begun. Under Stalin, the Soviet system hardened. But after his death in 1953, something shifted. Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes in a secret speech that stunned the party faithful. He promised reform to Stalinization and a thaw in the climate of fear. It was Khrushchev who pounded his shoe at the United Nations, who declared, "We will bury you." It was he who faced down the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, a moment when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. For 13 days, humanity held its breath. The missiles were withdrawn. The war did not come, but the tension endured. In 1964, Khrushchev was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, whose long rule would be remembered as an era of stability and stagnation. The Soviet Union reached the heights of military parity with the United States. In 1957, it had already shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. These were triumphs of science and national pride. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. The planned economy struggled to innovate. Consumer goods lagged behind the West. Citizens queued for bread and soap. Dissent simmered quietly. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn exposed the brutality of the Gulag system. In Prague and Budapest, reform movements were crushed by Soviet tanks, reminders that the empire would not loosen its grip easily. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union appeared powerful, but weary. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 became its Vietnam costly, grinding, demoralizing. At home, cynicism replaced zeal. The revolutionary fire of 1917 had cooled into bureaucratic routine. Then, in 1985, a younger leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev. He understood what many elders would not admit, that the system was failing. Gorbachev introduced Glasnost openness and Perestroika, restructuring. He sought transparency, reform, a socialism with a human face. But once truth begins to speak, it does not whisper. Censorship loosened. Citizens learned the full scale of Stalin's crimes. Nationalist movements stirred in the Baltic states, in Ukraine and the Caucasus. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, not by Soviet force, but by Soviet restraint. Eastern Europe slipped from Moscow's orbit. The Soviet Union itself began to unravel. In August 1991, pardoners attempted a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks rolled into Moscow once more, but this time resistance came not from foreign invaders, but from within. Standing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament was Boris Yeltsin, defiant, calling for democracy. The coup failed. The republics declared independence, and on December 25, 1991, the red flag bearing hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. After 69 years, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. What remains is not a simple verdict of triumph or tragedy. The Soviet experiment lifted millions into literacy and industrial modernity. It defeated Nazi Germany. It sent humanity into space, yet it also imprisoned millions, silenced dissent, and subordinated the individual to the state. Its history is a reminder of the power of ideas and the peril of unchecked authority. It is a story of hope hardened into control, of sacrifice woven with suffering, of a people who endured unimaginable trials in the name of a promised future. Empires rise with certainty, they fall with complexity. The Soviet Union was born in revolution and ended in reform. Between those two moments lies a human saga of farmers and factory workers, soldiers and scientists, believers and skeptics. A saga that shaped the 20th century and continues to echo in the 21st. For history does not vanish with the lowering of a flag. For history does not vanish with the lowering of a flag. It lives on. In memory, in identity, in the unfinished questions of power and freedom that still confront us today. In December 1922, in the aftermath of revolution, civil war, famine, and imperial collapse, a new state formally entered the world stage, the Soviet Union. It was not born in ceremony and celebration, but in exhaustion and resolve. The old Russian Empire had shattered under the weight of World War I and internal decay. The Romanov dynasty had fallen in 1917. The provisional government that followed had proven fragile. Out of that turbulence rose the Bolsheviks, determined not merely to seize power, but to transform history itself. At the center of this transformation stood Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary who believed that ideas, disciplined and organized, could reorder society. Lenin and his Bolshevik party had taken control in October 1917, promising peace, land, and bread. Yet seizing power was only the beginning. What followed was a brutal civil war between the Red Army, loyal to the Bolsheviks, and the White Forces, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, foreign interventionists, and others who opposed communist rule. From 1918 to 1921, Russia became a battlefield of ideology and survival. Cities changed hands. Railways were sabotaged. Entire regions starved. The Bolsheviks prevailed, not because the road was smooth, but because they were relentless, centralized, and uncompromising. By 1921, the Red Army had secured control over most of the former imperial territories. But victory had come at a staggering cost. Industry lay in ruins. Agricultural production had collapsed. Famine swept across the Volga region, claiming millions of lives. The revolution that had promised abundance now confronted scarcity. Lenin, pragmatic despite his ideological fervor, introduced the new economic policy, a temporary retreat from strict state control that allowed limited private trade and small-scale enterprise. It was a calculated pause, a recognition that the revolution could not survive if the people starved. Even as the economy struggled, the Bolsheviks faced another challenge: how to structure the vast lands they now governed. The former empire was a mosaic of nationalities, languages, and cultures: Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Belarusians, and many more. The revolution had proclaimed the right of nations to self-determination, yet the Bolsheviks also feared fragmentation. The solution they devised was both ideological and strategic: a federation of socialist republics united under a central government. On December 30th, 1922, representatives of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation signed the treaty creating the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was presented as a voluntary union of equal republics bound together by socialist principles. In theory, each republic retained the right to secede. In practice, power flowed from Moscow through the Communist Party, whose authority superseded regional autonomy. The structure balanced symbolism and control. National identities were acknowledged, but political authority remained centralized. The new state was built not merely on territory, but on ideology. Marxism-Leninism became the guiding doctrine. Marxism-Leninism became the guiding doctrine. The Communist Party was not simply a political organization. It was the vanguard of history, entrusted with leading society toward a classless future. Political pluralism was rejected as bourgeois illusion. Opposition parties were banned. The Cheka, the secret police established during the Civil War, continued to suppress dissent. The revolution had promised liberation from oppression, yet it quickly developed instruments of coercion to defend itself. Lenin envisioned the Soviet Union as the first spark of a global revolution. He believed capitalism was in its final crisis, and that workers around the world would rise in solidarity. The creation of the Comintern in 1919 aimed to coordinate international communist movements. The Soviet state thus saw itself not only as a nation, but as the headquarters of a worldwide struggle. Its existence challenged the established order of Europe and beyond. Yet within the leadership, debate simmered. Some favored a looser confederation of republics. Others insisted on tighter centralization. Lenin himself grew increasingly concerned about the concentration of power in the party apparatus. In his final writings, he warned against bureaucratic arrogance and criticized the growing influence of certain figures within the leadership. His health, however, was failing. After a series of strokes, he withdrew from active politics, leaving unresolved questions about succession and the direction of the revolution. Daily life in the early Soviet years was marked by contradiction. Propaganda posters depicted radiant workers and confident peasants building a new world. Literacy campaigns spread across rural areas, teaching millions to read and write. Women gained legal equality in marriage and employment, an extraordinary shift in a traditionally patriarchal society. Religion, long intertwined with the czarist state, was pushed aside as atheism became official policy. Churches were closed or repurposed. The old calendar was replaced. Even language was reshaped to reflect revolutionary values. At the same time, scarcity defined ordinary existence. Ration cards governed access to food. Housing was communal, with families sharing apartments once owned by aristocrats. The memory of war and famine lingered in every household. The revolution had altered the symbols of power, but it could not instantly erase hardship. Many citizens embraced the promise of socialism. Others complied quietly, wary of the consequences of resistance. The founding of the Soviet Union marked a decisive break with the past. The Romanov eagle gave way to the hammer, and sickle symbols of workers and peasants united. The capital shifted from Petrograd to Moscow, reconnecting the state to older Russian traditions even as it proclaimed a new ideological future. The Constitution of 1924 formalized the structure of the Union, outlining the roles of the republics and the supremacy of the Communist Party. It enshrined rights on paperwork, education, equality, while limiting political competition. Internationally, the Soviet Union faced suspicion and hostility. Many Western governments viewed the communist experiment as a threat to stability. Diplomatic recognition came slowly. Trade agreements were cautious. Yet the very survival of the Soviet state after Civil War signaled that it was no fleeting uprising. It had endured invasion, rebellion, and famine. It had consolidated power across 11 time zones. It had proclaimed itself the embodiment of a new social order. The birth of the Soviet Union was therefore not a single moment, but a process of consolidation, negotiation, and ideological assertion. It emerged from the ruins of empire and the crucible of civil war. It sought to replace autocracy with collective rule, private ownership with state planning, religious faith with secular doctrine. Its founders believed they were constructing not just a government, but a future in which exploitation would vanish and history would bend toward equality. The foundations laid between 1922 and 1924 would shape the trajectory of the 20th century, embedding within T. A new state both the aspirations that inspired millions and the mechanisms of control that would define its evolution for decades to come. When Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, the Soviet experiment stood at a crossroads. The revolution had survived civil war and foreign intervention, but its future direction was uncertain. Within the Communist Party, a quiet but decisive struggle unfolded. Out of that contest emerged a figure who had mastered the machinery of the party itself, Joseph Stalin. Appointed General Secretary in 1922, Stalin had used what seemed an administrative role to build alliances, place loyalists in key positions, and isolate rivals. By the end of the 1920s, he stood unrivaled at the helm of the Soviet Union. Stalin's vision was uncompromising. He rejected gradualism and hesitation. If socialism were to survive in a hostile capitalist world, he argued, the Soviet Union must transform itself rapidly into an industrial powerhouse. The nation, still largely agrarian and scarred by war, had to modernize or risk annihilation. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries, Stalin declared. We must make good this distance in 10 years. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928, was not merely an economic program. It was a mobilization of society. Steel mills rose from empty fields. Dams spanned mighty rivers. Entire cities like Magnitogorsk were built from scratch. As monuments to industrial ambition, workers were urged to exceed quotas to become heroes of production. The state controlled prices, wages, and resources. The rhythm of life shifted to the cadence of factory whistles and construction sites. But industrialization demanded resources, and those resources lay in the countryside. Stalin moved to collectivize agriculture, consolidating millions of small peasant farms into large state-controlled collectives. The policy was framed as a step towards socialist equality, but it unfolded as a campaign of coercion. Peasants who resisted were labeled kulaks, enemies of the people. Livestock was slaughtered rather than surrendered. Grain requisitions were enforced by party activists and security forces. The consequences were catastrophic. In Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and other fertile regions, famine took hold between 1932 and 1933. Villages emptied. Families starved in silence. The tragedy, later known as the Holodomor, left millions dead. The state denied the scale of suffering, insisting that production targets must be met. The drive for industrial growth did not slow, even as hunger hollowed the countryside. While factories multiplied and farms were reorganized, Stalin tightened his grip on political life. The Communist Party became both instrument and guardian of his authority. Dissent, once tolerated in internal debates, became treasonous. In the mid-1930s, the Great Purge began to sweep through the nation. What started as investigations into alleged conspiracies expanded into a vast campa, hidden of arrests, show trials, and executions. Prominent revolutionaries who had once stood beside Lenin were accused of betrayal. Public confessions were extracted, often under torture. Military leaders were purged, weakening the Red Army on the eve of global conflict. Ordinary citizens were denounced by neighbors or colleagues. The NKVD, successor to the Cheka, operated with quotas for arrests. Millions were sent to labor camps scattered across Siberia and Central Asia, forming a vast network later known as the Gulag. Fear became a defining feature of daily existence. Conversations were cautious. Letters were guarded. Children were taught to revere Stalin as a paternal figure, the father of nations, while adults learned the peril of misplaced words. Portraits of Stalin hung in schools and factories. Poems and songs praised his wisdom. The cult of personality elevated him beyond ordinary leadership, casting him as the embodiment of the revolution itself. Yet alongside repression stood undeniable transformation. Illiteracy declined sharply as education expanded. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working in factories, laboratories, and collective farms. Scientific research received state support. The Soviet Union, once economically backward compared to Western Europe, began to rival industrial powers in steel, coal, and machinery production. The pace was grueling, the human cost immense, but the results were visible in smokestacks and railways stretching across the vast Eurasian landscape. As the 1930s drew to a close, Europe drifted toward war. In 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, a move that stunned the world. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. When Germany invaded Poland, and in September 1939, Soviet forces entered from the east, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and parts of Romania extending its borders while avoiding immediate confrontation with Berlin. But the pact was temporary. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of Soviet territory. The German advance was swift and devastating. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Cities fell. Millions of soldiers were captured. The shock exposed the consequences of the military purges. Experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned. The survival of the Soviet state hung in the balance. Stalin, initially stunned, rallied the nation. The war became the Great Patriotic War, a struggle not just for ideology but for survival. Factories were dismantled and relocated east of the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers labored day and night to produce tanks and aircraft. Civilians dug trenches and fortified cities. Leningrad endured a siege that lasted nearly 900 days, its population starving yet unyielding. The turning point came at Stalingrad in 1940 to 1943. In brutal urban combat, Soviet forces encircled and defeated a German army. The victory signaled that the tide had turned. From that point forward, the Red Army advanced westward, pushing back the invaders at enormous cost. Villages lay in ruins. Fields were scorched. Entire communities had been annihilated. By May 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. The red flag was raised over the Reichstag, symbolizing both victory and vengeance. The war had claimed an estimated 27 million Soviet lives, soldiers and civilians alike. The sacrifice was staggering, the trauma immeasurable, yet the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, its influence extending across Eastern Europe. Stalin's authority, forged in revolution and hardened through terror, now stood crowned by triumph. The nation he had reshaped through industrialization and repression had defeated Nazi Germany. The factories built during the five-year plans had produced the weapons of victory. The centralized state had mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale. The post-war years saw reconstruction and further consolidation of power. Eastern European states were drawn into the Soviet sphere, their governments reshaped along communist lines at home. The apparatus of control remained intact. Suspicion lingered. New purges targeted perceived disloyalty. The atomic age dawned, and the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon in 1949, entering into strategic rivalry with the United States. Stalin ruled until his death in 1953, presiding over a state transformed beyond recognition from the one he inherited. In less than 3 decades, the Soviet Union had moved from agrarian backwardness to industrial might, from internal chaos to global influence. It had endured famine, terror, invasion, and total war. The legacy of those years was etched into its cities, its cemeteries, and its collective memory, shaping the character of a nation defined by both extraordinary resilience and profound suffering when the guns of the Second World War fell silent in 1945. The map of Europe was redrawn not only by treaties, but by armies. The Soviet Union stood astride Eastern Europe, its soldiers occupying Berlin, Warsaw, Budapest, and beyond. It had paid an unimaginable price for victory, and from that sacrifice emerged both pride and suspicion. The devastation of invasion remained fresh in memory, and Soviet leaders were determined never again to leave their western frontier exposed. Security would come through influence, and influence would come through ideology. In the years immediately after the war, communist governments were established across Eastern Europe, aligned politically and economically with Moscow. What the Kremlin described as a protective buffer, the West perceived as expansion. Thus began the Cold War, not with open battlefields, but with speeches, alliances, and competing visions of the future. The United States championed liberal democracy and free markets. The Soviet Union championed socialism and state planning. Each side believed history was on its side. The rivalry escalated quickly. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. The balance of terror was born. The arms race became a central feature of global politics, with each superpower striving for technological superiority. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, hydrogen bombs, and strategic bombers became instruments of deterrence. The world lived under the shadow of mutually assured destruction, a fragile equilibrium in which peace depended on the certainty of catastrophic retaliation. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, the Soviet leadership entered a period of transition. Out of internal power struggles emerged Nikita Khrushchev, a man who combined blunt rhetoric with reformist impulses. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and the excesses of the purges. It was a stunning moment, shaking the ideological foundations of the Soviet system. De-Stalinization aimed to soften repression and introduce limited reforms while preserving one-party rule. Yet Khrushchev's tenure was anything but tranquil. The Cold War intensified through crises. That tested nerves and resolve. In 1956, a popular uprising in Hungary sought greater freedom from Soviet control. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolt and signaling that Moscow would not relinquish its sphere of influence. The message was clear: reform had limits. At the same time, a different arena of competition captured global imagination: the race for space. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The small, beeping sphere orbiting Earth sent shockwaves through the United States and beyond. It was more than a scientific achievement. It was a demonstration of technological prowess. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could potentially deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The triumphs continued. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, a son of a peasant family elevated to global hero. His flight symbolized the promise of Soviet science and education. Schools celebrated engineers and cosmonauts. Posters depicted rockets soaring toward a communist future among the stars. The space race became a theater in which ideology and innovation intertwined, each launch a statement about the capabilities of socialism. Yet even as rockets rose skyward, tensions deepened on Earth. Berlin became a focal point of confrontation, divided after the war into sectors controlled by the Allies. The city symbolized the broader division of Germany. In 1961, faced with a steady flow of East Germans fleeing to the West, the East German government, backed by Moscow, constructed the Berlin Wall. Concrete and barbed wire cut through streets and neighborhoods, turning Berlin into a stark emblem of Cold War division. The most perilous moment of the era arrived in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the United States stationed missiles in Turkey and supported the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, Khrushchev sought to alter the strategic balance by placing Soviet nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. When American reconnaissance revealed the installations, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Military forces prepared for confrontation. In Moscow and Washington, leaders weighed decisions that could end civilization. Ultimately, a negotiated settlement emerged. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba, while the United States secretly pledged to remove its missiles from Turkey and publicly promised not to invade Cuba. The crisis exposed the terrifying proximity of annihilation and led to the establishment of a direct communication hotline between the superpowers. It also marked a turning point in Khrushchev's leadership, as critics within the Soviet establishment questioned his judgment. Domestically, Khrushchev pursued ambitious but uneven reforms. He invested in housing, constructing prefabricated apartment blocks to ease urban shortages. He promoted agricultural campaigns, including the Virgin Lands Initiative, seeking to boost grain production. Some efforts yielded temporary gains. Others faltered due to poor planning and environmental challenges. The centralized economic model struggled to adapt to consumer needs and technological complexity. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from power by his colleagues, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. The transition was presented as orderly, a contrast to earlier purges. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union emphasized stability and collective leadership. The era that followed would later be described as one of stagnation, but in its early years it carried forward the momentum of superpower status. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet Union maintained military parity with the United States. Strategic arms limitation talks sought to manage the nuclear rivalry, even as both sides continued to expand their arsenals. Proxy conflicts unfolded across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where each superpower supported allied movements and governments. The ideological struggle became global, influencing revolutions and counter-revolutions, far from Moscow and Washington. The Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated after the 1968 Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, asserted the right of the Soviet Union to intervene in socialist countries to preserve communist rule. When reformers in Prague attempted to create socialism with a human face, Warsaw Pact forces invaded to restore orthodoxy. The message echoed Hungary in 1956. Sovereignty within the socialist camp was conditional. Amid these tensions, everyday life in the Soviet Union carried its own rhythms. Citizens experienced pride in their nation's achievements, its victory in war, its leadership in space, its global influence. At the same time, they navigated shortages, bureaucratic rigidity, and restricted freedoms. The promise of communism remained powerful in rhetoric, even as practical realities revealed contradictions. The Cold War superpower years were defined by duality, fear and ambition, repression and reform, confrontation and negotiation. The Soviet Union stood as a rival equal to the United States, shaping global politics for decades. Its scientists sent probes to the moon and Venus. Its diplomats negotiated treaties limiting nuclear tests. Its soldiers guarded borders. Stretching across continents, the competition with the West drove innovation and militarization alike, embedding the Soviet state deeply into the geopolitical fabric of the 20th century. When Leonid Brezhnev consolidated power in 1964, he inherited a superpower at the height of its global reach. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear parity with the United States, commanded the loyalty, or at least the compliance, of Eastern Europe, and projected influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The turbulence of Khrushchev's reforms gave way to a promise of stability. Brezhnev and his colleagues in the Politburo sought predictability, order, and collective leadership. The revolutionary zeal of earlier decades softened into bureaucratic routine. Stability, however, came at a price. The Soviet system under Brezhnev emphasized continuity over change. Economic planning remained centralized. With 5-year plans dictating production targets, heavy industry and military spending continued to receive priority, reinforcing the Soviet Union's status as a strategic rival to the West. Yet innovation slowed. Managers focused on meeting quotas rather than improving quality. Factories produced goods that fulfilled statistical goals but often fell short of consumer expectations. Shelves in state stores carried limited selections. Lines became a familiar feature of urban life. Oil and natural gas exports provided a temporary cushion. Rising global energy prices in the 1970s filled state coffers, masking inefficiencies within the planned economy. Revenues funded social programs, subsidized food prices, and supported allied regimes abroad. Citizens enjoyed relative job security, access to education, and modest housing. The social contract rested on predictability. The state guaranteed employment and basic services. In return, citizens refrained from challenging political authority. Political life remained tightly controlled. The Communist Party maintained its monopoly on power. Elections existed but offered no genuine competition. Media outlets functioned as instruments of state messaging. Censorship persisted, though often less violently than in Stalin's era. Dissent did not disappear, it evolved. Intellectuals, writers, and scientists quietly questioned the system's rigidity. Samizdat literature circulated clandestinely, sharing banned texts and critical essays. One of the most prominent voices of moral opposition was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose writings exposed the brutality of the Gulag system. His work, smuggled to the West and published internationally, challenged the official narrative of Soviet progress. The state responded with harassment and eventual exile, signaling that while terror had receded from its earlier extremes, intolerance for open criticism remained. Internationally, the Soviet Union operated with confidence. The policy of détente in the early 1970s reduced tensions with the United States. Arms control agreements, including the strategic arms limitation talks, sought to cap the growth of nuclear arsenals. Diplomatic exchanges increased. Trade expanded cautiously. Yet beneath the language of cooperation, rivalry endured. Both superpowers continued to refine missile systems and maintained vast military establishments. The Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated after the suppression of reform in Czechoslovakia in 1968, cast a long shadow. It declared that socialist countries had limited sovereignty if their policies threatened the broader socialist community. This principle justified continued oversight of Eastern Europe. Poland, Germany, Hungary, and others remained firmly within Moscow's orbit. Reform movements were monitored closely. The memory of tanks in Prague served as a warning. Beyond Europe, the Soviet Union expanded its reach. It supported revolutionary movements and governments aligned with Marxist ideology. In Africa, Soviet advisors and resources flowed to Angola and Ethiopia. In the Middle East, Moscow backed Arab states in their confrontations with Israel. In Latin America, Cuba stood as a prominent ally. These engagements were framed as solidarity with anti-colonial struggles, but they also represented strategic competition with the United States. The most consequential foreign venture began in December 1979 when Soviet troops entered Afghanistan. The intervention aimed to stabilize a friendly communist government facing internal rebellion. What followed was a protracted and costly conflict. Afghan resistance fighters, supported by the United States, Pakistan, and others, waged guerrilla warfare against Soviet forces. The mountainous terrain, complex tribal dynamics, and porous borders turned the war into a grinding struggle. For Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts, Afghanistan became a harsh and distant battlefield. Casualties mounted. Reports of hardship filtered back home. The war strained resources and morale. Internationally, the invasion drew condemnation and contributed to renewed Cold War tensions. The United States boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Sanctions tightened. The image of Soviet invincibility began to erode. Domestically, the late Brezhnev years were marked by what would later be called stagnation. Economic growth slowed significantly. Productivity lagged behind Western economies, increasingly driven by technological innovation and consumer mania. The Arquette's corruption seeped into bureaucratic structures. Informal networks known as BLAT became essential for navigating shortages and securing goods. Cynicism spread quietly among citizens who sensed the gap between official optimism and everyday reality. Yet life was not uniformly bleak. Many Soviet citizens found meaning in community, family, and professional achievement. Education in science and engineering remained strong. Cultural life persisted within constraints, producing music, film, and literature that resonated deeply with audiences. The state continued to invest in large-scale projects and military research. Pride in the Soviet Union's global stature coexisted with private frustrations about inefficiency and restriction. Brezhnev himself embodied the era's contradictions. His leadership style favored consensus within the Politburo and avoided dramatic upheaval. Over time, however, his health declined and governance grew increasingly inert. Decision-making slowed. Younger, reform-minded officials found limited opportunity to rise. The aging leadership became a symbol of rigidity. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he was succeeded briefly by Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief who recognized the need for reform but lacked time to implement sweeping changes. His tenure was followed by Konstantin Chernenko, whose frail health reinforced the perception of a system running out of vitality. The rapid succession of elderly leaders underscored the absence of renewal at the top. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union remained a formidable military power, its missiles and tanks commanding respect. It retained influence over a vast bloc of allied states. Yet beneath the surface of strength lay structural weaknesses, an economy resistant to modernization, a political system war. West of boldness, a society increasingly aware of its own constraints. The promises of socialism had delivered stability and global prominence, but they had also produced inertia. The machinery of state continued to function, yet its gears turned more slowly, its confidence less assured as pressures accumulated within and beyond its borders. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union remained vast, armed, and formidable, yet it was weary. The promise of stability that had defined the Brezhnev years had calcified into stagnation. Economic growth had slowed to a crawl. Innovation lagged behind the technological revolutions transforming the West. Corruption lingered within bureaucratic corridors. Citizens navigated shortages with patience and quiet frustration. The state still projected strength abroad, but within its borders, the machinery of command felt increasingly brittle. In March 1985, a new leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, he represented a generational shift. Unlike his aging predecessors, Gorbachev carried an energy and urgency that suggested awareness of crisis. He did not seek to dismantle socialism. He sought to save it. Yet the path he chose would alter the course of the 20th century. Gorbachev introduced two words that would echo across continents: Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika, restructuring aimed to reform the stagnant economy by introducing limited market mechanisms, decentralizing decision-making, and encouraging efficiency. Glasnost openness promised greater transparency in government and a loosening of censorship. These reforms were not designed as revolutionary ruptures, but as corrective measures, an attempt to breathe life into a system losing momentum. At first, the changes seemed cautious. Managers received more autonomy. The prototypes were allowed to operate in certain sectors. Newspapers began to publish investigative articles exposing inefficiency and corruption. Television programs aired debates once unthinkable. Citizens who had long whispered criticisms in kitchens now heard them spoken publicly. The boundaries of permissible speech widened, and with them, expectations. Openness carried consequences. As archives were examined and suppressed histories revisited, the full scale of Stalin's purges and the suffering of the Gulag years became more widely acknowledged. Writers once banned were published openly. Public discussion of the Afghan war intensified, revealing its human cost. Families who had lived with private grief found collective recognition. The moral authority of the Communist Party, long sustained by controlled narratives, began to erode. National identities within the Soviet republics also reawakened. The Union had been structured as a federation, yet power flowed from Moscow. In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, citizens organized mass demonstrations calling for greater autonomy and increasingly independence. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, long suppressed grievances resurfaced. Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and others saw the rise of popular movements asserting cultural and political rights. Internationally, Gorbachev sought to reduce tensions with the West. Recognizing the unsustainable burden of the arms race, he engaged in negotiations with the United States. Meetings with President Ronald Reagan produced agreements to limit intermediate-range nuclear forces. The rhetoric of confrontation softened. Soviet troops began withdrawing from Afghanistan in 1989, ending a conflict that had drained resources and morale. The Cold War, long defined by suspicion and rivalry, entered a phase of cautious thaw. The most dramatic transformation occurred in Eastern Europe. For decades, the Soviet Union had maintained control through the implicit threat to force, as demonstrated in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Under Gorbachev, that doctrine shifted. He signaled that Moscow would not intervene militarily to preserve communist governments in Allied states. Reform movements took notice. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept across Eastern Europe. Poland held semi-free elections, leading to a non-communist government. Hungary opened its borders. In East Germany, protests swelled. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, long a symbol of Cold War division, was breached by jubilant crowds. Guards, uncertain and overwhelmed, allowed citizens to cross. Images of people standing atop the wall, chipping away at concrete barriers, circled the globe. The division of Europe, enforced for decades, began to dissolve. Within the Soviet Union itself, political reform accelerated. Gorbachev introduced competitive elections for a new Congress of People's Deputies. Televised sessions revealed heated debates and sharp criticisms of the establishment. One of the most prominent voices was Boris Yeltsin, a former party official who broke with Gorbachev and championed more radical change. Yeltsin's populist appeal grew, particularly within the Russian Republic, the largest and most powerful component of the Union. Economic conditions, however, worsened. Partial reforms disrupted existing structures without creating a fully functioning market system. Shortages intensified. Inflation surged. Citizens who had hoped for swift improvement encountered uncertainty and declining living standards. The credibility of gradual reform weakened as hardship deepened. With 1990 and 1991, several republics declared sovereignty, asserting that their laws took precedence over those of the Union. Lithuania declared independence outright. Tensions flared between central authorities and nationalist movements. In some regions, violence erupted, exposing the fragility of the multinational state. By the summer of 1991, Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new Union treaty that would grant greater autonomy to the republics while preserving a looser federation. Hardliners within the Communist Party, alarmed by the unraveling of authority, feared that the treaty would dissolve the Soviet Union in all but name. On August 19, 1991, while Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea, a group of senior officials launched a coup attempt. Tanks rolled into Moscow. A state of emergency was declared. The coup plotters misjudged the moment. Citizens gathered in defiance. Boris Yeltsin climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, calling for resistance and condemning the coup as unconstitutional. Images of his stance, resolute and visible, became emblematic of a turning tide. The military hesitated to use force against civilians. Within days, the coup collapsed. Its failure accelerated the disintegration it sought to prevent. The Communist Party was suspended. Republic after republic declared independence. Authority shifted rapidly from Union institutions to Republican governments. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and would be replaced by a Commonwealth of independent states. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the red flag-bearing hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin and replaced with the tricolor of Russia, a state that had emerged from revolution in 1922, that had industrialized at immense human cost, that had defeated Nazi Germany and rivaled the United States in nuclear might, dissolved not in foreign conquest, but in internal transformation. The collapse reshaped global politics. The Cold War ended without a final battle between superpowers. 15 independent states emerged from the former Union, each confronting the challenges of sovereignty, economic transition, and national identity. For millions of citizens, the end brought both liberation and dislocation. The certainties of state employment and centralized order gave way to markets, competition, and political pluralism. The ideological struggle that had defined much of the 20th century gave way to new questions about power, democracy.
Democracy gave way to new questions about power, democracy,
and memory as the structures of the Soviet era receded into history while its legacies persisted in institutions, borders, and lived experience. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.